I recall one incident in Chicago where we were doing a club, and I think the ticket price was $7, and a roadie had spotted the promoter outside one of the side doors, letting kids in and just taking the money. Peter Grant got in the back of the queue. He didn't notice it was Peter Grant in the queue until he saw these Zuni Indian rings that he used to have on his fingers. And I'll never forget, Pete, I'll have that, thank you very much, and snatched the bag off the guy's hand. But he was there defending his artist.
Peter Grant built his reputation on unwavering loyalty and absolute control. His presence in the music industry was unlike anything seen before.
No one could approach Led Zeppelin without talking to Peter Grant. And as the group became the most powerful group in the world, consequently Peter Grant became the most powerful manager in the world.
While most managers worked within the system, negotiating and compromising to secure the best deals for their artists, Grant tore the system apart, reshaping the way bands were treated and ensuring that Led Zeppelin were never exploited the way countless musicians had been before them.
Don't fucking talk to me, it's my bloody act.
He just had a way of dealing with people.
He was not a negotiator. He was a fighter, a man whose intimidation tactics were legendary, whose refusal to bend to industry standards made him one of the most powerful figures in rock history.
It's what I call verbal violence, you know. You don't actually say, I'm going to do this to you, but you intimidate them. That's the game, intimidating them. Verbally.
Grant didn't just protect Zeppelin from promoters, record labels and bootleggers, he was equally ruthless in choosing who he worked with.
Doesn't matter as long as there's an extra nickel to be drained. By exploiting Led Zeppelin, it's great.
If he saw an artist as weak, indecisive or lacking in commitment, he had no time for them.
You rented it and you control it, isn't selling fucking pirate posters.
There were no second chances, no sentimental attachments, no patience for those who failed to meet his standards.
Grant believed that nothing was more important than the musicians, and he insisted that they were paid what they were owed. He forced executives and concert promoters to play by his rules, and he never took no for an answer.
His belief in long-term vision, artistic integrity, and total dominance meant that few musicians earned his respect, and even fewer managed to stay in his orbit for long. His history in the industry brought him into contact with some of the most talented musicians of the time, but many of them frustrated, disappointed, or outright enraged him. To Grant, Led Zeppelin were the greatest band in the world, and anyone who failed to match their dedication was not worth his time.
A lot of times the bands or the singers, pop singers, they'd never even see their managers. He traveled with them, he was with them all the time. Very few managers did that.
The Yardbirds had already lost their momentum by the time Grant stepped in to manage them in 1967. Once a band at the forefront of British blues rock, they had cycled through three of the most iconic guitarists of the era, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and Jimmy Page. But by the late 1960s, their internal energy was gone. Keith Relf and Jim McCarty were exhausted by the rock world, growing disillusioned and longing for a softer, more folk-driven direction. Grant saw what was happening immediately. He had no interest in managing a band that was unwilling to fight for its place. The final American tour in 1968 was a disaster. The band's performances lacked fire, and the tensions within the group were becoming impossible to ignore. When Relf and McCarty announced they were leaving, Grant made no effort to convince them otherwise. He had already made his decision. The Yardbirds were a lost cause, but Jimmy Page was not.
Back in London, guitarist Jimmy Page told Peter about his plans for a new band. He wanted Peter to be involved.
I remember I was with him, we were driving down Shaftesbury Avenue or somewhere one day, and I said, what are you going to do, You're going to go back sessions or form a new band? And he said, well, I'm going to get a new band together. Will you help sort it out for us? I said, fine.
Grant's focus had already shifted, and he moved quickly, helping Page recruit new musicians who would be fully committed, fully driven, and fully in sync with his vision. Robert Plant, John Bonham, and John Paul Jones joined, and the Yardbirds' name was abandoned in favour of something much bigger.
And that's how we started, and eventually a bunch of musicians became Led Zeppelin.
The moment Led Zeppelin came into existence, Grant cut all ties to the past. He never looked back.
But Zeppelin could never have conquered the globe without the foresight and commitment of their manager, Peter Grant.
Jeff Beck was another musician who, despite his incredible talent, failed to meet Grant's expectations. Beck was a guitarist of extraordinary ability, perhaps one of the greatest of his generation, but he was also erratic, impulsive, and unreliable. He had a habit of forming bands, generating excitement, and then abandoning the project before it could develop into something lasting. The Jeff Beck Group had the potential to be one of the biggest rock bands of the era, featuring young stars like Rod Stewart and Ron Wood, but Beck's constant lineup changes, cancelled tours, and unpredictable behavior ensured that they never reached their full potential. Grant had no patience for that kind of instability. He needed musicians who understood that long-term success required consistency, commitment, and a clear sense of direction. Beck, for all his brilliance, operated on impulse. He would assemble a band, tour for a few months, then disband it in frustration, only to start again. Grant wasn't willing to waste his time with an artist who couldn't commit to the bigger picture. He later remarked, "Jeff could have ruled the world if he'd wanted to, but you can't do that when you're changing your mind every 5 minutes." The music industry was full of people Grant despised, but few represented everything he hated quite as perfectly as Mickey Most.
You know, when I was in business with Mickey Most, he did all the Hermits things, the Donovan things, and, you know, so many sessions. He did all Mickey's sessions.
Most had built a reputation as one of the most successful British producers of the 1960s, working with artists like The Animals, Donovan, and Herman's Hermits. He knew how to manufacture hit records, how to control artists, how to shape their sound for maximum radio appeal. To Grant, he was the ultimate representation of the industry's worst instincts, a man who prioritized commercial success over artistic integrity, a businessman who saw music as a product rather than an art form. Grant had worked with Most briefly, but their approaches were fundamentally incompatible. Most wanted total control over his artists, dictating what they recorded, how they recorded it, and when they released it.
Earlier managers like Colonel Tom Parker viewed their artists as commodities to be bartered for sacks of loot. Grant treated his artists like royalty.
Grant saw that as an insult to everything he believed in. He ensured that Zeppelin would never be subject to the same constraints that had limited so many others.
Peter put his artists on a pedestal. Their word, their wish, their music, the way they wanted to play it, that was the most important thing in his life.
No forced singles, no label interference, no outside producers trying to shape the band into something more marketable. Grant's entire approach was about giving Zeppelin complete artistic freedom, and Most was the exact kind of industry figure who threatened that freedom. The moment Grant gained full control over Zeppelin's management, Most was shut out entirely.
No one could approach Led Zeppelin without talking to Peter Grant. And as the group became the most powerful group in the world, consequently Peter Grant became the most powerful manager in the world.
You do the music and I'll take care of everything else. I'll deal with the record company, promoters. I mean, that's what a manager does, but it really was that sort of division. Don't even think about anything else. I won't bother with anything else. You know.
As Zeppelin rose to dominance in the early 1970s, comparisons to other hard rock bands became inevitable, much to Grant's annoyance. Deep Purple and Black Sabbath were often mentioned alongside Zeppelin, with critics and fans alike attempting to group them together as part of the same movement. Grant hated that comparison. He refused to acknowledge the idea that Zeppelin had peers or rivals. To him, Zeppelin stood alone, above and beyond every other band in existence. Deep Purple had a similar blend of blues, rock, and long instrumental jams, while Sabbath's heavy riff-driven sound often led to lazy comparisons. Grant dismissed them outright. "They're doing their thing," he once said, "but let's not pretend it's the same thing we're doing." While Zeppelin were expanding the boundaries of what rock music could be, Deep Purple and Sabbath were still playing by the rules. Grant saw Zeppelin as more than a rock band. They were a cultural phenomenon, a group that transcended genre and category. Black Sabbath, in particular, was a band that Zeppelin's camp viewed with a sense of mild disdain. While Zeppelin incorporated mysticism, blues, and a wide range of musical influences, Sabbath leaned into a dark, oppressive heaviness, their sound defined by relentless riffs and themes of doom and destruction. Zeppelin's music evoked mystery and grandeur, while Sabbath's was more primal and aggressive. The two bands were not in competition, but Grant made sure that Zeppelin were always seen as something greater. Grant's belief in Zeppelin's supremacy was absolute. He wasn't interested in comparisons, rivalries, or feuds. He wanted the world to see Zeppelin as untouchable, operating on a level no other band could reach. His aggressive management tactics, his refusal to compromise, and his determination to protect his artists from the industry's worst forces ensured that Zeppelin remained at the top for over a decade. He had no regrets about the people he left behind. The Yardbirds had been a waste of time, Beck had been too unpredictable, most had been too controlling, and the idea that Zeppelin had equals was an insult to everything he had built. In his eyes, he had done exactly what needed to be done. He had taken a band of 4 musicians and turned them into the biggest rock act on the planet. He didn't care about the enemies he had made along the way. He didn't care about the people he had dismissed, discarded, or outmaneuvered. He had only one goal, and in the end, he achieved it.